There's something that happens when you try to disappear someone from their own life. When you decide, in the quiet of your own home office, that someone's achievements don't belong in your version of family history. That a photograph of them just standing there, in their uniform, doing their job becomes threatening enough to dismantle years of careful planning. And here's what nobody tells you about that kind of fear. It destroys everything it touches, including the person who's consumed by it. We're going to talk today about a woman named Sienna, and about how her father's terror of irrelevance cost him his relationship with her, nearly cost her a fortune in stolen inheritance, and ended up fracturing a family in ways nobody could have predicted. But more importantly, we're going to talk about how Sienna saw something so many people miss when family members suddenly turn cruel. Sometimes the cruelty isn't about you at all. Sometimes, it's a person's last desperate attempt to stay in control of a story that's already written without them. This is the kind of story that hits different when you realize how close Sienna came to never speaking up at all. The text message came at 5:47 inches the morning on a Tuesday in April, right when Sienna was tying her running shoes before dawn PT. She almost didn't look at it, almost went through her whole physical training session, all the stretches and the brutal cardio, and the shower afterward, without seeing what her father Richard had typed and hit send on. But she did look. She read it twice. Then she sat down on the edge of her bunk, still holding her phone in her hand, and she didn't move for what felt like a very long time. Think about that for a moment. What message is so carefully constructed that you need to read it twice to accept it's real? It was 11 words. 11. The wedding guest list is full. You won't be invited. No apology, no explanation. No I'm sorry, kiddo, or this is difficult, or even, we need to talk. Just a statement of removal, delivered like an order he expected her to follow without question. Here's where it gets important. Sienna had requested leave from her job 3 weeks earlier. She'd bought a dress she almost never wore, the kind of thing that hangs in the back of your closet between deployments, collecting dust and old regrets. She'd chosen a wedding gift, a set of hand-blown glass vases her sister Emily had mentioned once during a trip years ago, when they still talked about things like decorative glassware instead of silence and hurt. She'd mapped the drive. She'd planned to leave early so she could help Emily with whatever last-minute chaos wedding week always involves. She'd done everything you're supposed to do when your sister is getting married and your family actually wants you there. Everything. And then, 6 days before the ceremony, her father decided the guest list was full. I want to be honest with you about something. Most families have weird relationship dynamics. A dad who's controlling, a mom who keeps peace by staying quiet, siblings who get shuffled into different positions, based on who's easiest to manage. If you've ever been the child who asked too many questions, who didn't fit into the mold your family was trying to force you into, who chose their own path instead of walking the one your parents carved out, you know that particular flavor of isolation. You know what it feels like to be the difficult one. Sienna knew it better than most. She'd joined the military at 22, partly because she wanted to serve, partly because it was the first place in her entire life where competence was actually rewarded instead of quietly resented. Her father never could understand that. To him, her uniform wasn't an achievement, it was a rejection. Every promotion, every assignment, every commendation felt to him like another brick in a wall she was building between herself and the family version he wanted her to be. When she made captain, he'd said, "And listen to how cold this is. That's your job, Sienna. It's not a personality." When Emily bought her first house, he'd called it the proudest day of his life. And when Sienna couldn't make it home for Christmas because of deployment, he'd told relatives she'd chosen the army over family. Nobody ever asked what the army had chosen for her. So when the text came through that morning, Sienna did what she'd trained herself to do with almost every hurt. She put the phone in her pocket, finished tying her shoes, and went out to formation. She didn't cry. She didn't call her father to fight about it. She typed back one sentence hours later, after PT and briefings, and a full day of walking around with a stone sitting in her chest. "Understood. I won't come." Her father didn't respond. She hadn't expected him to. And here's something I need to say out loud because it matters. People like Richard Caldwell don't do follow-up conversations. They issue a ruling and consider the matter closed, the way a judge might dismiss a case he never intended to listen to in the first place. That night, Sienna lay in her quarters staring at the ceiling, and she started doing what a lot of trauma survivors do. She ran logistics instead of feelings. She calculated the cancellation of her leave. She thought about the dress, the gift, the drive. She told herself it didn't matter that she'd accomplished things he never would, that her worth had never actually depended on his approval. She almost believed it. Then, at 11:20 p.m., her phone rang. Emily's name lit up the screen, and Sienna let herself hope for just a second that this was her sister calling to fix everything, to say the text had been a misunderstanding, that of course she was still coming. She answered, and for the first time, she heard something in Emily's voice she hadn't heard in years, genuine fear. Dad just saw a photograph. Her sister's voice was thin and shaking. What photograph, Emily? There was a breath. Just one. But it felt loaded with something Sienna couldn't quite name yet. Someone from his old military unit posted something on Facebook. A group photo from an awards ceremony you did back in spring. You're standing next to some general. Sienna's mind went blank. Then it clicked into place. Fort Belvoir. Late March. Cold enough that her hands had gone numb. She'd been standing at attention for almost an hour. She remembered shaking hands afterward, remembered General Samuel Whitmore, saying a few words about the work her unit had done, remembered a phone flashing nearby. She hadn't thought about it since. It was just a Tuesday with a camera in it, nothing more. Okay, she said slowly. And that's a problem because… What exactly? Emily's voice cracked. He's been staring at it for an hour. He called me the second he saw it. He wanted to know how long you'd been a major. Sienna gripped the phone tighter. I wasn't hiding anything. Emily, it's public information. It's on my uniform. It's been on my uniform for 2 years. I know, Emily whispered. I know that. But Dad said… She stopped. And you could hear her deciding whether to finish the sentence. What did Dad say? He said you were trying to embarrass him. He said you posed for that photograph on purpose, knowing it would get back to him. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being accused of something so twisted that you almost laugh. Sienna almost laughed. But there was nothing funny about it, just a kind of tired disbelief. By standing in a photo at an official ceremony? I know how crazy that sounds, Emily said quickly. I'm just telling you what he said. He was upset. But then Emily said something else, and this is the moment everything changed. He said you weren't supposed to be there. That sentence sat strangely in Sienna's ear. Not supposed to be where? The ceremony had been hers to attend. Her work, her unit, her award. There was no version of that day where her presence required anyone's permission. And that was the moment Sienna understood what was actually happening. This wasn't about a photograph at all. Her father hadn't been afraid of a picture. He'd been afraid of what the picture proved. Her daughter had built a life and a reputation entirely without him, one significant enough that men like General Whitmore knew her by name and shook her hand in public. He didn't fear the image. He feared what that image revealed, a version of his daughter he hadn't gotten to shrink down to size first. Emily, Sienna said carefully, why does it matter to Dad who I stand next to in a photograph? Emily didn't answer right away, and in the silence, Sienna could hear her breathing uneven, like she was working up to something difficult. There's something else, Emily said finally, her voice dropping so low it sounded like she was afraid of being overheard even though she was alone in her own home. Dad's been saying things. To David. About you. Sienna's stomach tightened. What kind of things? About Grandpa's estate. Another pause. Longer this time. A pause that contained weight. He told David that you don't have any claim to it. Picture this. It's past midnight. Sienna's sitting in military quarters thousands of miles from her family. And she's just learned that while she's been thinking her father's rejection was about her ambition, he's been actively telling other people she's not entitled to her own inheritance. She sat completely still. Outside, somewhere across base, a vehicle pulled into a lot, headlights sweeping across her wall. I didn't know I had a claim to anything, Sienna said, finally. That's what I thought too, Emily said. But the way Dad talks about it, it's like there's something specific he's trying to keep David from asking about. Something about the money. Let me stop here and name what Sienna did next, because it matters enormously for understanding who she is. She didn't call her father. She didn't call her mother. She didn't have an emotional meltdown or vent her frustration, or let her family's dysfunction drive her into reactivity. Instead, she did what military training teaches you to do in a crisis. She gathered intelligence before she moved. The next morning, she found a civilian estate attorney 2 counties away from her parents' home, someone with no connection to her family, no history with the Caldwell name, no reason to soften anything for her benefit. She didn't mention her rank when she called. She didn't need an advocate. She needed a reader, someone who could look at documents and tell her in plain language what they actually meant. And then she did something that took real courage. She started requesting records, public probate documents, her grandfather's will, estate filings. She spent 2 nights after duty hours sitting at a folding table in her quarters with a laptop and a legal pad, cross-referencing dates and account numbers, feeling less like a daughter and more like an officer building a case file. Here's what you need to understand about someone who's been trained to see patterns in data and follow them to their logical conclusion. They don't stop. They don't get tired. They just keep pulling the thread until the whole sweater comes undone. And that's exactly what happened. What Sienna found didn't come all at once. It came in pieces, the way most uncomfortable truths do. There was her grandfather's will, dated 11 years earlier, naming both Emily and Sienna as equal beneficiaries of a trust funded by the sale of his hardware business. Equal. Not favored, not divided by some formula that secretly gave more to one granddaughter. Equal, in their grandfather's own handwriting, in a document he'd clearly taken time to get exactly right. But somewhere between his death and now, a significant portion of that trust had been restructured, moved into a newly created family fund administered not by a neutral trustee but by her father alone, Richard Caldwell, sole signatory. She stared at that line for a very long time. She told herself there could be reasonable explanations. Families restructure finances, trustees change. It didn't automatically mean something was wrong, so she kept reading, and then she found something that made her hands go still on the keyboard. A withdrawal made 4 years ago. An amount large enough that it wasn't a rounding error or an administrative fee. The date of that withdrawal lined up almost exactly with the closing date on Emily's first house. Think about that timing. Think about what it means. Sienna sat with that for a while before she let herself feel anything about it. Because here's what matters. She wasn't angry at Emily. Not in that moment. Honestly, not at any point after. Her sister didn't forge anything. She didn't ask their father to move money. As far as Sienna could tell, Emily had simply been told it was family money. A gift from Dad. Generosity dressed up as nothing more complicated than a father helping his daughter start her life. Emily had no reason to question a story that made her the favored daughter while painting Sienna as strong enough not to need help. What hurt wasn't the money. What hurt was the calculation underneath it. Her father had decided that whatever their grandfather intended for, Sienna could simply be redirected without her knowledge or consent, without even being asked. Because he'd built a story where Sienna didn't need it. She had a paycheck. She had discipline. She had the army. That made her self-sufficient. Meanwhile, Emily needed protection. Emily needed help. So Emily got it. Sienna called her mother that night, mostly out of habit, the instinct that makes you check a wound even when you already know it's going to hurt. Her mother answered on the second ring, and something in her voice told Sienna she'd been waiting for this call for much longer than she realized. "Your father said you wouldn't understand," her mother said before Sienna had even finished explaining what she'd found. "Understand what?" "That he wanted to give Emily a fresh start. That's all. He didn't think of it as taking anything from you and me. I didn't think so either, at first. So what was I supposed to get?" The silence on the other end answered before her mother did. It stretched long enough that Sienna understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its bluntness. There had never been a plan for her, not because she was owed less, because somewhere in her father's mind, her strength had been reclassified as surplus. She could simply go without. But then she went back to the documents, and she found something else. Something prepared but not yet executed. A new transaction dated for a window that fell just weeks before Emily's wedding. The amount attached to it wasn't a rounding error either. It was larger than anything that had moved before it. Her father was preparing to move even more money, and then came the wedding day itself. Sienna spent it exactly where her father had decided she belonged, 300 miles away, covering a colleague's shift, so someone with young children could have their weekend. She didn't cry. She didn't drink. She didn't stare at the clock. She worked. And here's something I need to say because it illuminates everything about how people like Sienna survive family trauma. Sometimes it's easier to work than to sit with your own absence. The wedding happened without her, and she found out what was said about her days later, once Emily had had time to digest it herself. According to her sister, when a cousin asked where Sienna was, Richard had answered smoothly, without hesitation, with the kind of practiced ease that comes from rehearsing a lie until it feels like truth. Madison couldn't get leave, he'd said. You know how the army is. A few heads nodded. Nobody questioned it. Why would they? It was a reasonable explanation delivered by a reasonable-sounding man, and none of them had any reason to know that Sienna's leave had been approved 3 weeks earlier, that the only obstacle to her attendance had been a text message from him. Emily said later that something about the moment didn't sit right with her, even before she understood why. A distant relative had pressed a little further, half joking about whether Sienna and their father were still not talking. And Richard had answered sharper than the question warranted. She's always been more interested in the army than family, he'd said. Emily told Sienna she remembered that sentence specifically because it was the first moment all day when something about her father's version of events felt performed rather than true, like he was reading from a script he'd been practicing. But she didn't say anything at the reception. She smiled, accepted toasts, danced with David, and let the day carry her forward on momentum and noise. It was David who found the folder. That matters. He wasn't looking for anything. He was searching for a spare phone charger during the reception, ducking out for 2 minutes while Emily was occupied with photographs, when he came across a manila folder on the corner of Richard's desk, half tucked beneath unopened mail. His father-in-law's handwriting was on the tab. Estate. Final. David didn't open it fully. He glanced enough to see numbers that didn't look small, language about a fund transfer, a signature line still waiting to be filled. He put it back exactly where he found it and said nothing. But something about it stayed with him the way certain small, wrong-shaped things do, sitting at the back of your mind until you can't ignore them anymore. 2 days after the wedding, David brought it up with Richard directly, and I want you to imagine what courage that took a man who barely knew his father-in-law, asking a direct question about family finances. He kept his tone respectful, careful, framed as a simple question rather than an accusation. He asked what the transfer was, whether it involved Emily, whether there was anything they needed to understand about assets going forward. Richard's response was immediate and cold. This is family matter, he said. It becomes my matter, David replied, when my wife's inheritance is involved. That sentence apparently ended the conversation. Richard didn't answer any further questions. He simply told David the matter was being handled and that he'd appreciate David staying out of it. But David called Sienna that same evening, and I want to be honest about how strange that call must have felt at first. A man she barely knew, her sister's new husband, someone she'd met maybe 4 times, calling to tell her he thought her father was mishandling money that might partly belong to her. But there was something steady in the way he spoke. No theatrics, no agenda beyond a simple discomfort with watching someone be lied to. And Sienna understood something in that moment that most people miss. Sometimes the person who helps you isn't family. Sometimes it's a stranger willing to ask the uncomfortable question. 2 days later, Emily called. And this time when she spoke, her voice had lost all softness. She'd found a copy of the same document David had seen, left carelessly on a printer. And this time she'd read it in full. She'd seen the numbers. She'd seen their grandfather's original will referenced by name. And she'd seen something that made her breath catch. Her own signature line was there. But Sienna's wasn't. An empty line where her sister's new husband's signature was supposed to authorize a transfer of money that should have belonged partly to Sienna. An unsigned document authorizing the movement of inheritance from a trust their grandfather had specifically, deliberately named them as equal beneficiaries of. 3 days after the wedding, Richard called a family meeting. He didn't call it that. He phrased it to Emily as clearing the air before things get out of hand, which was, as Sienna would later understand, his way of controlling the conversation before anyone else could shape it. He asked Emily and David to come by Sunday afternoon. He didn't invite Sienna. Emily did that herself, without telling him, and Sienna drove down that morning without announcing it to anyone but her sister. She walked into her parents' living room a little after 2 o'clock on a Sunday that would change everything, and she watched her father's face do something she'd rarely seen in 34 years. It faltered. Just for a second, a flicker of surprise before he rebuilt his composure into something closer to irritation. "You weren't invited," he said. Her voice stayed level. She'd learned long ago that volume is often mistaken for strength, and that the quietest person in a room is frequently the one everyone listens to. And yet somehow you're still causing problems, Richard added. I didn't cause anything, she said quietly. You always do. Sienna didn't argue. She set her bag down on the coffee table, unzipped it, and began laying out what she'd gathered one document at a time, in the order that told the story most clearly. Her grandfather's original will, the paperwork creating the family fund, the withdrawal that lined up with Emily's house closing, the unsigned transfer dated for a window that had already passed. She didn't raise her voice through any of it. Let's stop talking about feelings, she said, and start talking about this. Emily picked up the first page and read it slowly, the way people read things they're afraid to fully understand. The way her eyes moved down the page, the way her expression changed, Sienna watched her sister finally grasp what had been done to both of them. You told me this was your money, Emily said, looking up at their father, her voice different now, harder. You told me it was a gift. It was family money, Richard said. That's not what you told me, Emily replied, and there was an edge to her voice she'd never used with him before. Not anger exactly. Something closer to betrayal, learning how to stand up. Richard turned toward Sienna instead of answering Emily, the way he always did when situations stopped going his way, when he needed someone to blame. She's always been jealous of you, he said to Emily, nodding toward Sienna. This is what this is about. Jealousy. I want to pause here, because this moment is important. Sienna didn't respond to that accusation. She'd expected it, honestly. Some version of an old, worn blame meant to shrink the conversation back down to something familiar and manageable, sisters competing over their father's approval, instead of a grown man mismanaging money that wasn't fully his to move. What she hadn't expected was Emily. What Emily did in that room changed everything. Stop blaming her, her sister said. The room went quiet in a way that felt different from all the silences before it. Her father actually looked at Emily, startled, like he was seeing his younger daughter clearly for the first time in years. And think about what that moment meant. Emily had spent her whole life being protected, praised, positioned as the easier, more agreeable daughter. She'd never had to ask hard questions, because someone was always managing the answers for her. Watching her stand there, documents in hand, defending her sister, instead of accepting the story she'd been handed, that was its own kind of reckoning. For him, for her, for all of them. Richard still had one card left, though. The one he always reached for when logic failed him. He turned back to Sienna, and his voice rose for the first time. You think wearing that uniform makes you better than us? He said. The room seemed to hold its breath. Sienna looked at him for a long moment before she answered. Not because she needed to think about it, but because she wanted him to feel the weight of the pause, the way silence can hold more authority than a raised voice ever could. No, she said. It just taught me that rank doesn't matter when you're wrong. And for the first time in his life, Richard sat in a room full of people who loved him and found himself with nothing left to say. Her mother stood in the doorway of the kitchen with her arms crossed, quiet in the particular way she'd always been quiet. But Sienna could see something shifting in her face, some old guilt finally surfacing after years of staying underwater. David didn't say much. He didn't need to. He'd already done his part simply by asking the question that started all of this, by refusing to let family matter be a good enough reason to look away. Emily set the documents down on the table gently. I need to understand all of it, she said. Everything. Not just what you're telling me. Richard didn't respond right away. For the first time since Sienna walked in, he looked less like a man defending himself, and more like a man realizing the story he'd built for so long no longer held together under the weight of the truth, sitting on his coffee table. Nobody moved to leave. The documents were still spread across the coffee table. Richard was still standing near the window with his arms crossed. But something in the room had shifted from confrontation into something closer to reckoning. Emily was the one who finally asked the question that had been sitting underneath everything since the night she first called Sienna crying. Why were you so afraid of that photo? She asked. It's not even about the estate, really, is it? What was it actually about, Dad? Sienna answered before he could, because by then she understood it better than he probably wanted to admit out loud. The photo wasn't the problem, she said, and she kept her eyes on him while she spoke. General Whitmore wasn't going to swoop in and fix anything. He's not part of this. He's just a man I saluted at a ceremony. Her father stared at the folder on the table, like it might rearrange itself into something less damning if he waited long enough. The problem was that you finally saw me standing somewhere you never expected me to reach, and you couldn't control the story anymore. Think about that. For years, Richard's version of his oldest daughter had been carefully maintained. Difficult. Stubborn. Chose the army over family. A daughter who didn't fit neatly into the shape he'd built for what a Caldwell woman was supposed to be. That version worked fine as long as it stayed inside their house, repeated at dinner tables and holiday gatherings, where nobody outside the family had reason to question it. But a photograph doesn't ask permission to exist. It doesn't wait for a narrative to be arranged around it first. It simply shows what's true. And what that photo showed was a woman in uniform, a major standing beside a general who clearly respected her, in a moment that had nothing to do with rebellion or difficulty. It showed competence. It showed a life he hadn't authored and couldn't take credit for. You knew Grandpa's name, Sienna continued, because she'd done enough research to understand this piece too. Not through me. Through some old veterans organization you were connected to a long time ago. Records from a fund he used to support. That's the extent of it. It was never about me showing off. It was a coincidence you couldn't stand. Her father finally looked up. For a moment, Sienna thought he might deny it, might reach for another accusation. Instead, something in him seemed to give out. Like a structure that had been under quiet pressure for longer than anyone realized. I needed one day, he said quietly, where nobody questioned me. The room went very still. That's when Sienna understood, truly understood, what had been happening all along. That's why you didn't want me at the wedding, she said. It wasn't a question anymore. It was never about the guest list. He didn't answer directly, but he didn't need to. Emily was watching him now with an expression that was grief and clarity mixed together, the look of someone realizing that the version of their father they trusted had been curated as carefully as anything in that folder. You were going to ask questions, Sienna said, about the fund, about Grandpa's will, about where the money actually went. You couldn't risk that happening in front of everyone you'd invited. So, instead of being honest with me, you erased me from the day and told people I'd chosen not to come. I never wanted it to go this far, Richard said. And for the first time, his voice had lost its edge. It had become something quieter, almost tired. I told myself I was protecting the family, protecting Emily, giving her something you didn't need. You didn't get to decide what I needed, Sienna replied. You just decided it was easier not to ask. Her mother spoke up then from the doorway. Her voice was small but steady. I should have said something years ago. I told myself staying quiet kept the peace. It didn't. It just meant one of my daughters carried all the weight of what the other one never had to think about. Her father didn't respond to her either. He sat down slowly in the chair by the window, the folder still on the table in front of him, and for a long moment, nobody spoke. Sienna watched something settle over him that looked less like anger and more like exhaustion. The particular fatigue of a man who'd spent years managing a story so carefully that he'd forgotten how to exist without one. You didn't need a perfect wedding, Sienna said finally. You needed a room where no one knew the truth. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself again. He just sat there in the quiet, while 4 people stood around him, holding a version of the truth he could no longer rearrange in his favor. Emily reached over and picked up the unsigned transfer document, the one dated for a window that had already passed, the one that would have moved even more money out of a fund that was never his to move alone. This isn't happening, she said. It wasn't a question either. Not like this. Not anymore. The attorney Sienna had hired filed a formal request for an accounting of the family fund. Richard, faced with the paperwork Sienna and Emily had already assembled, didn't fight it. I think some part of him understood that the story had already changed shape too much to be pulled back together. The pending transfer was frozen before it could execute. An independent audit was ordered on the fund's history, going back to the year it was created. It would take months to fully untangle, but the unsigned document that would have moved the largest sum yet never got a signature. That much at least was stopped in time. Emily wasn't asked to return the money that had gone toward her house. That part had already happened. Already been folded into a life she and David were building together, and unwinding it wouldn't have repaired anything. But she had to sit with a harder truth than a repayment schedule. She had to accept that she'd benefited quietly, and without asking questions from a system that had decided Sienna didn't need what was legally hers. That's not a comfortable thing to carry. But I watched her carry it anyway without flinching away from it, which told Sienna something essential about who her sister actually was. Emily called Sienna a week after the family meeting. Her voice was steadier than it had been in years. "I should have asked you," she said, "about everything. I never once asked what you were owed or what you'd lost, or why you weren't at the table more. I just accepted what I was given, and didn't look too closely at where it came from." "Yes," Sienna said. It's okay. Don't worry about it, because some wounds don't need to be smoothed over to be forgiven. They need to be named honestly first." Her mother apologized too, in her own quieter way, over coffee one afternoon a few weeks later. She didn't try to explain away her silence. She just said she was sorry for choosing peace over honesty for so many years, and that she understood now that the peace had never really existed. It had just been quiet on the surface, while someone underneath it went unheard. Her father lost control of the fund. The court appointed an independent trustee to manage what remained of their grandfather's estate, splitting it finally the way it had always been intended, equally between his granddaughters. And here's the thing nobody talks about when family members finally face accountability. It doesn't feel like victory. Sienna didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel satisfied. She just felt the quiet, uncomplicated truth of it. Things had changed. Not perfectly, not painlessly, but honestly, which was more than they'd ever had. Richard Caldwell is still Sienna's father. That part doesn't change, and she never wanted it to. But he no longer gets to decide quietly and from a distance who deserves a seat at the table and who doesn't. A year passed, and Sienna came home for Thanksgiving. Emily opened the door before she even knocked, like she'd been watching for her car. She hugged Sienna the way she used to when they were kids, tight and unguarded, and for a second, neither of them said anything at all. Inside, the table was set the way it always was. Except for one thing. An empty chair right where Richard usually sat. "Where's Dad?" Sienna asked. "He said he wasn't coming," Emily said, quietly. Sienna looked at that empty chair for a long moment. She didn't feel triumphant about it. She didn't feel the satisfaction she might have expected years earlier, if someone had told her this was how things would end up. She just felt the quiet, uncomplicated truth of it. Things had changed. And something I need you to hear right now, because it applies to your own life too. Sometimes being left off someone's guest list isn't actually about you being unwanted. Sometimes it means the people already seated are afraid of what you'll say when you finally sit down. If you've ever been the person who asked hard questions and got called difficult for it, if you've ever had to build a life outside the shape someone else designed for you, if you've ever carried the weight of being strong while someone else got to be protected, this story probably landed with you in a way it might not land with someone else. The lesson here isn't really about revenge or vindication. The lesson is about recognizing when someone's cruelty toward you has nothing to do with who you actually are, and everything to do with their own terror of irrelevance. Sienna could have stayed silent. She could have let her father rewrite her absence as her choice. She could have accepted his narrative and carried that shame quietly for the rest of her life. But she chose to gather evidence instead. She chose to present truth in a way that couldn't be argued with. And she chose to let family members decide for themselves whether they wanted to keep believing a comfortable lie or accept an uncomfortable reality. Here's what you can do today, based on Sienna's story. If there's a situation in your own life where someone's treated you unfairly and you've been absorbing the blame they're trying to place on you, I want you to ask yourself one question. Is the story they're telling about me actually true? Or is it convenient for them? Because sometimes the only power you need is the power to look at the evidence of your own life and say, out loud, this is what actually happened. This is what was actually owed to me. And I'm not carrying shame for something I didn't do. Now I want to know, where are you right now? What time is it where you're watching? And more importantly, if you've ever been in a situation where someone tried to rewrite your story to protect themselves, what did you do? Drop a 1, 2, or 3 in the comments. 1, if you think Sienna was right to confront her father the way she did. 2, if you think the situation was more complicated than that. 3, if this whole story hit you because you're currently dealing with something similar in your own family. I read every comment, and your answer matters. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe. We share stories like this, stories about people choosing truth over comfort, about family reckoning, about what it actually means to reclaim power every single day on this channel. Thank you for sitting with Sienna's story today. Let's keep this journey going. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences. Fully rewritten and reimagined in Houston, Texas to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.